Thank you for joining us today for this panel about gender diversity and inclusion as part of the DASICON conference about women empowerment and gender equality. My name is Pape DIOUF, and I will be the moderator. It is my pleasure to be the moderator of this panel about gender inclusion. As you all know, the international commitment to advance gender equality have brought about improvement in some areas, such as child marriage or female genital mutilation. But as part of the SDG 5 of the United Nations, but the promise of a world in which every woman enjoys full gender equality and where all legal, social, and economic barriers are removed remains unfulfilled. So the topics of this panel comes in handy, and we are very much looking forward to a thought-provoking and interesting dialogue with our distinguished guests. And I'll start off with introducing our first panelist, Mrs. Helen Todd, who is the co-founder and the CEO of Sociality Squared. Mrs. Todd, thank you for joining us today. And I will also give you a brief presentation of our other panelists that will follow along the way. Mr. Christian Berger, who's economic consultant at the Vienna Chamber of Labor, and who's also a lecturer at the WU Vienna. Mr. Christian Berger, thank you for joining us today. Professor Zoe LEFKOFRIDI, whose area of specialty is politics and gender, diversity and equality, and who's the scientific director of Gender Up in the University of Salzburg. Professor, thank you for joining us. And finally, we have Mrs. Stefanie Meyer, who's a political scientist at the FH campus, Vienna. Dr. Meyer, thank you for joining us. And I'll start off with asking Mrs. Todd to give her insights about this topic of gender diversity and inclusions. Mrs. Todd, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you for having me today. I'm zooming in from Cincinnati, Ohio, and today is actually my company's 11th anniversary. No, I mean, when it comes to any type of diversity in the broadest sense of the word of anything that is different, you know, we embrace that here at Sociality Squared. And, you know, we also have the belief we work through our clients to make a positive impact through content. But if you take the most marginalized, which is trans Black women, and lift them up, you lift all of society up. And you're never going to, it helps everyone when you address any marginalized people. So accepting and being inclusive of all gender identities is best for everyone. And in general, you know, my wish, I have a niece who's 9 years old, is that when she grows up, or just even now, that she has an inherent worth, that she is worthy because she exists and not because of anything that society puts on her in terms of her gender, her worth, based on owning a company, net worth, or whatever. So that's my wish for everyone. And there's an entire industry right now that's trying to convince women that they're worthy. In the United States and around the world, we have Black Lives Matter trying to convince Black people that they're worthy. And we need to live in a world that accepts people for who they are, however they identify, and that they're worthy by inherently existing. So that's where I come from in this panel, and I'm super excited to be part of this conversation.
Thank you, Ms. Todd, for your insightful remarks. And you are right in pointing out that we're living in a society that is towards an egalitarian way of life, but still have a long way to go. And I will now ask Mr. Christian Berger to give us his insights about this topic of gender inclusion.
My focus, or the focus of Marita Haas and my work, is on organizational change. we still believe that the gender gap, or to put it more broadly, the gender gaps will not close somehow by themselves, but through organizations and institutions. Rules and regulations have to prioritize gender equality in order to make change therefore possible. So gender equality is not only a management issue, but a fundamental right. It is about equal chances, opportunities that lead to a good life, and participation in social and economic decisions. Gender diversity, inclusion, this triad, to me all sounds very positive, like marketing speak, I have to add, and also like buzzwords. It is well known that in our society, inequality based on sex and gender, race and class is widespread and even constitutes the essence of the social structure of our coexistence. So it is more than buzzwords we are talking about. And this leads to gender defining whose rights, bodies, work and living time are worth how much and how little. And especially in these days, we have to notice that women are extremely overworked, underpaid. When they work, they earn less, their work counts less, their bodies are often treated like things. For example, in the culture industry, women are not, it's not only sex that sells, but everything garnished with women's bodies sells better. At least that's what people think. But we have to confront all of this if we want change. And a gender future, in my perspective, a gender equal future, a future which is based on equality in diversity, a vision that needs systematic transformation and systematic transformation strategies on the way to its realization. And for Marita and my work, that means gender in action, to get gender on every agenda. That means to analyze gender in processes, structures, institutions, to deconstruct processes and reconstruct them in a gender equal way, and gender equality as a political objective. Yes, that would be my first statement on the topic of the breakout session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Berger. And I would just want to ask you a question before we move on to our next panelist, because you pointed out the economic stakes of gender equality. And if you bear in mind that half of the working age population in the world is women, how do we achieve, and what are the economic stakes to gender equality, and what is the way towards that? How do we achieve closing the gender gap and, for example, bringing gender action, not just as a political agenda, but also as a political agenda with economic stakes that are supposed to be met?
On a political level, there are long-standing demands that that from a feminist perspective can be formulated and should be formulated again and again. In the socio-economic field, a prominent demand would be a gradual shortening of the working week to 30 hours and a quota, but on many levels in business, not only in management, but on very different business levels in politics and in public life. There's a great need for salary transparency, to make equal pay at work work. That's very important. But on a economic level, from my perspective, there must also be, or there has also be a change in a political economy. From a feminist political economy perspective, it should be emphasized that the division of labor and capital not only runs along class lines, but also transversely along gender lines. And the invisible and unpaid work of women in households, for example, cooking, homeschooling, cleaning, raising children, caring for those in need of care in the broadest sense, has to be more recognized and independently of crises and economic fluctuations, because they are quite constitutive for a gainful employment and the capitalist accumulation model in general. So there has to be a very holistic shift in our view of work and the worth of work.
Thank you very much, Mr. Berger, for pointing out that also the social inequalities not just move along class lines, but also along gender lines. I think that's a very important thing to point out. And my next question actually will go into that line, and it will be addressed to Mrs. Meyer. Mrs. Meyer, your area of expertise is feminist movements and theory building, and you deal a lot with right-wing extremism and populism. What are the obstructions and the obstacles you usually meet along the road when doing that fight for gender equality in that area?
Okay, that's a huge question, and it addresses all types of different levels of what political work are we talking about now. Are we talking about academic work, about feminist theorizing? I think there is a very special kind of resistance against this type of work. It's from my experience, we don't feel that much in Austria yet, but we have very many examples, for example, in Switzerland, for example, in Germany, where academics have been threatened, their employers have been called and asked to cancel their contracts, and so on and so on. So this is the very specific academic line of work. But if we're talking more generally, if we're talking about gender equality initiatives, and I think this can't be stressed enough, all types of initiatives that try to improve the awareness for sexual diversity, especially in the educational sector. So sexual education in schools, there we have these groups of, they mostly call themselves concerned parents, but often quite intimately linked to political players, also to Christian conservative players and actors that mobilize against this, that use a very specific, very interested way of reading this educational material in order to start their campaigns against this, that are fueled by homophobia, basically, by transphobia, by opposition to all types of gender diversity or sexual diversity. So this is a very important area, I think, this educational area. And of course, another debate, even though I think many people have the feeling that they don't want to talk about this anymore, but it's still an ongoing debate, is the question of gender-sensitive language, the use of gender-sensitive language, which is often framed by right-wing actors, but also, again, by Catholic fundamentalist actors, as a dictatorship, as a totalitarian measure that's imposed on people, instead of understanding it for what it is, one means of inclusion of women, but also of people of different gender identities into language, at least. Yeah, so this was one way of putting it very briefly. Maybe if I still have a few moments,
Of course, you can
okay,
proceed.
thank you. Then I would like to say a few things about the broader context. when we look at the forefront of the discourse, we see kind of a mosaic of different actors, different issues, different topics that are brought to the front in this type of anti-gender, anti-feminist movements. If we look at it a bit more systematically, we see that it very much started with the Vatican's campaigns against the notion of gender in documents from UN conferences in Beijing and Cairo, mainly in the mid-1990s. So this is where this idea that there would be a gender ideology that would be promoted by feminists, by the UN bureaucracy and so on, where this more or less started. And from there on, it has grown in appeal. It has been transformed, of course, along the way. It has been picked up by right-wing actors. So what we see now is very much a result of this process of the last 25 years, in which a discourse, this very specific discourse, this very specific misunderstanding of the term gender has become more politically relevant.
Thank you very much for your insightful intervention. And I would just ask Mrs. LEFKOFRIDI if she has something to add in that issue or that topic of inclusion in general.
I have sent you my presentation. I don't know if you have received it.
Yes, we did.
So first of all, let me thank you for the invitation, and I would like to congratulate you for putting together this great program. I guess you know that I was also once upon a time a student at the Diplomatic Academy, so I've been there where you are, and I know how hard it is to organize conferences, so really congrats for this amazing program. So I was invited to speak about my research, and I chose gender stereotypes in politics, which I think connects to many of the topics that the previous speakers mentioned. This is a source of bias that is invisible. So, we talk about structural problems, and obstacles and policies, but gender stereotypes focus on the individual level. So I will invite you through this talk to check your own biases and the way you evaluate people around you, and to see whether you are also, I can tell you already, you have them and you use them. So please move on to the next slide. So what these are implicit assumptions. So they're not explicit. So it's not like conscious non-egalitarian beliefs. It's not that I consciously think that there is a hierarchy between men and women, whites and blacks. So it's like, it's something that I don't know I'm doing, but it has a very big effect on what I expect from people. And it also has an effect on how I evaluate the performance of people. And these stereotypes that concern gender are, of course, rooted in historical roles of men and women in society. Please move to the next slide. I have here a nice commercial from the 50s to illustrate that these kind of stereotypes, they are not just describing how men and women are and behave, but they're also prescribing, they are conveying something about how they should behave. So it's just about how they are, it's also about how they should be. Please move to the next slide. So these assumptions that are actually studied very much in the field of psychology, but in my work, I connect this knowledge from psychology with gender studies and political science. So what I'm focusing on is whether these assumptions exist and whether they play a role in how we think of politicians, the people that take decisions about us, the community. So these assumptions can refer to personality characteristics like traits, but they can also refer to interest. So we assume that men are interested in X and women are interested in Y, and also that they are competent in different policy fields because of their gender. Please move to the next slide. So what are the, could you please move to the next slide? So what are these assumptions? So men are typically assumed to be more assertive and decisive and rational and strong, you know, able to provide leadership, show ambition, and you know, be knowledgeable, know stuff, you know, being an expert. And women, on the other hand, are assumed to be very warm and caring and compassionate and consensus building and emotional and kind and passive. So these assumptions about personality traits. So, you know, basically we are giving, you know, we ascribe traits on people based on their gender without really knowing them. This happens without us understanding it, that it happens. And so these stereotypes, they impact how we perceive individuals and also their suitability for specific policy portfolios. So whether they're fit for the job. Could you please move to the next slide? This is very important in politics as well as in many other professions, but you know, because politics, not because I studied, but politics is, you know, about who gets what and how. It's about power. So it's really the most, I think the best example of how we can discriminate against women just, you know, like based on implicit assumptions that we're not even checking. So men are typically associated with the fields of the policy fields of security, defense, and economics, whereas women are typically associated with, you know, like family ministries, child policy, health policy, environmental policy, and of course, gender equality. Could you please move to the next slide? So we asked, you know, like how widespread are these stereotypes? And most of the evidence we had thus far was coming from the US, actually also from Ohio specifically. But we had no evidence from Europe. And, you know, we know that in terms of politics, European multi-party systems are very different from the US two-party system. So we said we're going to test this hypothesis in Finland, which is a pioneer in gender equality. So, you know, if we find stereotypes in politics in an egalitarian paradise, then all the other countries that do not have this level of gender equality are very likely to have, their people are very likely to hold stereotypes. Could you please move on to the next slide? So we found that in Finland, in this egalitarian paradise, when you ask people, you know, and you ask them like, would, you know, a female politician, how would you like relate this adjective to a female or to a male politician? Most people tend to see no difference, which is great. But when they see a difference, it is in the stereotypical direction. And we see, even in Finland, that assertiveness is associated with male politicians and ambition, whereas compassion and less so consensus building is associated with female politicians. So even there, where you have no segregation anymore, you have, I mean, I guess you know about the recent cabinet in Finland, which is young and female, but they also had a female president. So it's like really a very different country compared to all the rest. And there, you know, you still see this problem. Could you please move on to the next slide, and actually to move on to the next. Yeah, so what we did was to look also at Austria and Switzerland and to see whether these countries also have this, whether we observe the same trend. So what we found was actually that, yes, most people say that there is no difference between male and female politicians. But in fact, 1/3 to 1/2 of respondents do have stereotype views. And there we also found that ideology plays a role. As Dr. Meyer mentioned, it is a very important factor, ideology. And we find that right-wing voters are most likely to hold such stereotypes, especially to think that men are better, you know, to deal with defense issues and women are better to deal with social policy issues. Now, an interesting finding is that the left-wing voters think that women are better in dealing with migration policies. So, you know, like the compassion stereotype. And we see that since we are in Austria, we need to mention that Austria does perform worse. It doesn't have the same trajectory as Finland. It's actually like lying behind. But we see similar trends. Despite different levels of gender equalities, we do see similar trends. I have more slides with the graphs, but I don't want to take up time from the others. So you can just jump to the last slide, and then if you're interested, I can show you more details. Yes, here, the second last. So ideology does matter, and we see that stereotypes still exist in egalitarian paradises and in non-egalitarian paradises. But you know, if you compare these European countries to other regions in the world, they are, you know, like super well ranked. But still, even there in Western Europe, in the so-called developed world, we see this problem. So it is still a major problem. And so a limitation of the study is that I had a binary understanding. It was just men and women, which was a problem. But just to tell you that we were the first to gather data from national election studies. So first we had to convince the people organizing the election studies that stereotypes, you know, are interesting to study in the first place. So, you know, the next step is to also include a more fine measurement of femininity and masculinity, because obviously this is a very binary way of examining this. But nonetheless, these are, you know, this is first evidence from Europe on this, showing that we all need to be reflective and to check every time you evaluate your colleagues, your friends, you know, students, teachers. Beware that you might have a bias that you are not even aware of. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. LEFKOFRIDI, for this insightful intervention about implicit bias and also assumptions that surprisingly are even present in egalitarian and advanced societies like the Nordic states, for example. And actually, we have a question from someone in our audience who would like to know, how do you convince people who perceive diversity as a threat that it is actually benefiting them? And I think it's a question for everyone in the panel who would like to answer it.
I can kick it off. I don't think, and actually it was AOC said this at South by Southwest 2 years ago when we were still meeting in person, that you're never in one conversation going to like aha someone into changing their mind. And one of the really important things when it comes to any type of stuff is to, and I know in the US, we do this a lot where if you don't agree with me, it's very polarized, and people go into conversations like, I'm going to convince you I'm right. And it gets very divisive very quickly. And if you enter any conversation like that, the other side is immediately going to put up the guard and be defensive and not even have an open mind to what you're saying. So in approaching conversations like this, it's more beneficial to ask open-ended questions, respect wherever the person is coming from, and then share your point of view, why you believe it, and give them like a rope or a way out, and leave, like, just plant seeds, because you're not going to aha them. But if they feel respected, they're going to be more open to hearing what you have to say, and then marinate on it. And then over time, it's like, if they feel respected, then they're going to be more open to your point of view. So I would say, don't ever think that you're going to aha someone, but respect where they come from, share your values and why you value it, and leave it open like that. So that would be my recommendation.
Very interesting answer indeed. Would anyone like to add something to that?
If I may,
Yes.
I would like to pick this up. And I absolutely agree with this point, especially when it comes to discussions with, to everyday discussions, let's say, to someone you meet in person or even over Zoom or something. But when it's a person-to-person meeting, what I think differs from this are settings where there's an open debate, a debate that's for the public. There, I think the question somewhat turns, then it's not so much about kind of changing someone's point of view, but when it's more about, you know, giving a presentation for an audience. And I just wanted to mention that because I think, while I absolutely agree with this open approach on a personal basis, I think this does not mean that every point is equally valid and should have the same kind of stage, the same kind of outreach provided for them. Because that's sometimes a debate that follows in the wake of this question of how do you talk to someone. Yeah, that's just what I wanted to add to it. Thanks.
Yes, thank you very much. And now I would just want to know, there is also a very frequent debate about competence as opposed to inclusiveness, for example. And I recall a few days ago when the Director General of the World Trade Organization has been appointed, Mrs. Ngozi, the former financial minister of Nigeria, she was a Black woman. And she said, being Director General should be a matter of competence. Then if that person's happen to be a woman, then fine. But now I want to know, what is, for example, in your opinion and your experience, how one strike the balance between competence and inclusiveness, for example?
So thank you. This is very connected to stereotypes because our ideal of, you know, leader, like a political leader, you know, at this level, is male, because historically there were more white men leading. So that's, you know, like how we have, so the stereotype we have for agency and leadership and the stereotype we have for male is the same. So when you have a woman at this, you know, role, there is a dissonance because we have all these expectations that I mentioned earlier that are implicit and, you know, unconscious, that she should be warm and kind and compassionate, but, you know, this does not really fit the leadership, you know, stereotype that is like, blah, you know, like Worf, like, you know, assertive and aggressive. And so there is a problem there. But I think that what we should, you know, point out here is that this is a false debate, because when you put it in this way, it means that what we have known until now goes unquestioned and unchallenged. So it's true that the people that we have had as leaders until now were really competent to be there, which is not true, because actually they were there because they were male, and that was not, you know, challenged. So there is a very, very good study published 3 years ago. I can send you the title. It's called Gender Quotas and the Crisis of the Mediocre Man, Theory and Evidence from Sweden. So Sweden, again, you know, Scandinavian paradise, in the 90s, they introduced these zipper lists at local level. So what happened? So, you know, like the question is, once you put like so many women into the system, will competence decrease? Actually, what happened was that the mediocre men disappeared. So actually, the more women you put in the race, the higher the competence of men. So this connects now to, again, Dr. Meyer's right-wing populism and extremism. So who is actually against gender equality? The people that actually feel are losing from it. You know, the ones that feel that putting more women in are actually threatening them professionally. So I think, you know, once you think of all these dimensions, you realize that actually, as we heard earlier, it's the framing of the question that is actually leading us to completely wrong ways of thinking. It's a wrong, you know, framing, I think. Thank you.
I think it is very interesting indeed. And it actually reminds me of the stereotype of pointing out a woman who is, for example, very goal-driven as someone who's bossy, and a man who is very goal-driven as a leader, which is actually still comes from that implicit bias that we talked about earlier. And also, I wanted to know, what is your opinion about how gender binary affect the world structure? You know that closing the gender gap also is very much discussed, but we feel like people put on the table topics, discuss them, but actions don't follow. Should it be a top-bottom approach with pressure from below, from entities that are not even political, maybe? And or should it be something that comes up from the top, from an upper level?
I mean, I can speak to a little bit on the business structure side. And something to the question prior that I answered to, it needs to be top level, like from executives setting in the business setting, setting the setting the vision and making sure that it's applied throughout the organization. And one thing that happens is that they'll read an article in the Harvard Business Review. It's like, oh, gender diversity, or right now DE&I is really big. And it's like, let's hire one person and see what happens. And they hire someone for 6 months, a year, and they don't see the results, the measurement or the ROI, and then it fails. It's like, well, that doesn't work. So it needs to be from the top and applied, but it also needs to, the companies need to have the culture ready to apply these different things to make sure everyone feels included and the right policies are in place. And I think one thing that you always have to be careful of when you say bottom up is not to turn to the people who are marginalized and be like, how do we fix this? It's not their problem to tell those who are oppressing them in whatever way how to fix it. And you don't want to, we just need to put together the environments and culture where they can thrive, where everyone can thrive as individuals in the workplace. So I think that's one thing when you say bottom up, to be really careful of, but everyone in the company and the culture needs to be set in place where everyone feels comfortable and can thrive. And be part of that. But I do think that it needs to come from the top down to set the vision for the entire company.
Yes, thank you for that insight in the business world, that pointing out that the top-bottom approach is interesting, but it should not be also the only element in contribution. Yes, Mr. Berger, please.
Yes, I can fully agree with what Professor LEFKOFRIDI said earlier. Because of our traditional stereotypes, the competition for well-paid and influential positions in business and politics is severely disturbed. Mediocre, qualified, or even incompetent men are being flushed to the top, and studies show while committed and highly qualified women and men who are also qualified but but are not in line with the traditions and stereotypes are left behind. Why? These studies show that these stereotypes are very well at work, and men surround themselves with other men who look like them, who act like them. Because people or social groups who want to maintain and secure their position of power tend to act like this. and this is most likely when they surround themselves with people who pose no threat to them. And this does not change by itself, and that's why we need example given a quota system and a clear political framework and objection is needed, along with changes at many other levels, which were pointed out, gender on the agenda in every meeting, and in organizational structures, in our thinking in the culture industry, and so on and so forth.
And just to add to that too, once you hire diverse and have more diversity in executive positions, you'll see that the entire organization starts to become more diverse in and of itself. So one of the solutions is hire diverse and put them in executive positions too. So, which, just to add to that.
Yes.
I think it is very important also to bear in mind that not only the culture of diversity should be a policy of inclusiveness within the enterprise, but also, for example, in business, bear in mind that the clients and even the market share, a large of them comes from diversity background, and that it can be helpful for both sides actually. And just to mention that Ms. LEFKOFRIDI, the title of the Swedish study she mentioned is Gender Quotas and the Crisis of the Mediocre Man. You can find it at the Theory and Evidence from Sweden, American Economic Review in 2017. And the last question from our audience is that, is there somehow a way to mitigate gender bias under a psychological point of view? Yes, please, Ms. LEFKOFRIDI.
I mean, you need programs. I mean, my colleagues mentioned also, like before, it's related to the previous question. You need at different levels, you need policies, but you also need to think of an incentive structure about how people will behave. I think Mr. Berger mentioned transparency. You know, we need to like have, you know, understand that the whole process from the moment of recruiting, you know, to the moment of promoting, when you're thinking, you know, like, whom are you going to give a promotion? And you have, you know, like this woman with 2 kids, and you're like, should I give her this, you know, job? You know, she might have like a sick child, like in 2 weeks, you know, she might not be here. Like there are all these assumptions. And how do you, you know, how do you mitigate that if you don't give men, like dads, incentives, you know, and some kind of policy that encourages dads to behave the same? Because once this is, you know, out of the picture, this difference, who is like doing the parenting or the childcare, because there is an assumption that women do it, and there is a fact that women do it. The statistics show that most women are spending more time than their partner in, you know, household duties and parenting duties and stuff. So of course, like these assumptions are sometimes related to real facts that are related to structural problems. But the thing is, what about the bias? The most important thing is to get the right person for the job because of their qualifications. And the problem with gender stereotypes is that very often you don't get the right person for the job because all these biases are distorting your evaluation. So the major thing here is to become aware of the bias. So in order to do that, you need training programs, you know, like where people are really checking. I'm telling you, and I'm always honest, I tell that to my students, I am studying stereotypes and I catch myself where stereotypes are in action, and I'm like, I caught you now. You're not going to make me, you know, have a distorted, you know, decision now, but they're inside us. We really need to become aware of them. And that's the thing. It's not that men are biased against women. Women are biased against women too. And against themselves, you know, their self-perception is biased, you know. So once you become aware of this is the first step. But as Helen TODD said, this is not only the responsibility of the individual. You need planning, you need a company or institutional policy to increase awareness. So it's like many different levels, but you need the incentives also to bring, you know, this diversity, like gender and diversity budgeting. Reward them if they promote diversity. I will say one last sentence. In academia, you mentioned earlier the networks that were mainly male. In order for the EU to break this pattern, they made funding, EU funding, conditional to the diversity of the composition of the research team. So suddenly all these male networks had, you know, like they had to find a woman to cooperate with them, otherwise they wouldn't get the money. So they were forced. That's how women came into this like big bang, you know, projects, the comparative projects that had like millions of euros. Otherwise, they would never get there. And now the last EU rule is that once there are two excellent proposals and one project has more gender balance than the other, it will be prioritized. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. LEFKOFRIDI, for this very insightful answer. I think we have someone in the audience who would like to ask a question. Ms. Philippa Rice, would you like to ask your question maybe?
Yes, thank you very much for your insights. My question, I would like to know what is your opinion about including trans women's experiences to the same degree of cis women's experiences in the feminist movement? So what are the main issues that people see, especially when we see the rise of trans exclusionary radical feminists? So what would be the main issues that this group of people see in terms of including trans women in the same to the same degree of cis women, and what would be the gains of this inclusion? Thank you.
Yeah, if I may, I would like to say a few things about this, because actually this was what I had prepared for my statement, more or less. Not only trans women's inclusion, but this was rather what I thought about when I read about this panel. And I think our debate right now very clearly showed why it's not so easy, even though I believe we would all agree that inclusion of trans women into the feminist movement, inclusion of trans women's political demands into feminist agendas would be something we all wish for, would be something that would increase diversity and thereby, by being more diverse, strengthen feminist movements. So I think the pros are very clearly on the table. But I think our debate just showed why it's not always that easy, why we quite often need binary gender data, for example, to prove structural inequalities, to show that structural inequalities are really there, and to devise strategies against it. And we briefly had the issue of gender quotas, for example, on the table. That gender quotas don't necessarily have to exclude trans women, but they do include a lot of gender identities that do not fit neatly into categories of male and female. So I think it's really not that easy to keep both sides of this problematic equally in view. This is the one thing that we do have. Our world is structured by a binary gender systems that is unequal, that disadvantages women, and on the other side keep this from my point of view, so very, very important insight of queer feminism, that the gender system as such, and not only because it's hierarchical, but the gender system as such is violent and does violence to people, and therefore should be kind of a target of feminist activism. But I think if we try to put it into practice, we run into some quite difficult problems, which I think might explain why it's not so easy for all feminists to embrace this inclusion.
Yes, please, Mr. Berger.
That would be basically my answer to it's not that easy. Unfortunately, the complexity of gender inequality, sexual inequality needs to be reduced for pragmatic reasons and emphasized at the same time. But I'm so afraid I have to say goodbye at this point. I urgently need to move to another call. It was a very productive and interesting and fine exchange. Thank you and take care.
Thank you, Thank you for joining us, Mr. Berger. That was nice having you. And because also we are running behind in time, I would like just to ask a final question to the remaining panelists. As a last word, what advice would you give to the youth who wants to fight for gender equality and inclusion for a more diverse world, but don't know what are the ways or what is the path that you should take? What is your last word for them?
First, check your privilege. Be aware of your biases, and do not pit different inequalities against each other, because if you are in favor of equality and diversity, you cannot exclude any group. So, I mean, this is also like coming from the intersectionality debate. It has been an issue, what you just said, you know, like, would feminists, you know, like, would they bring like all the different, you know, divergence to the fore, or would they like have a very coherent, small, women's focused message? And Black feminism was the first to challenge this, you know, like, so where was the position of Black women? Should they fight with Black men to get equal rights with whites, or should they fight with white women for women's rights? So, you know, if you're for equality, you cannot have like this, I think you cannot have a hierarchy between inequalities. Any type of exclusion is problematic. So if you concede for one group, you cannot fail not to cede for another group. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. LEFKOFRIDI.
Yeah, I mean, I would just follow up with that. There's a great feminist, Sonia Renee Taylor, and she talks about the ladder of oppression. So if you start putting, you know, whether it's white females over Black females, if someone's always on top of someone else, that's part of the problem with like, you know, the white male at the very top. So if we want to have a truly inclusive society, you've got to break down the ladder, get off the ladder, and really treat everyone in the most inclusive way possible. And something that Gloria Steinem said that I thought was really interesting from my own personal experience, that everyone here, or the students, are kind of young, and you might not feel the sexism at your age. And for me, I didn't feel sexism. I was like, oh, I'm a woman. I was raised very like I could do anything that I wanted to put my mind to. And she said something that was really interesting, that women tend to become more radical the older that they get, because they experience it more in that. And that resonated with me, because that's kind of what happened. So if you're in the audience and think that, oh, this debate is, you know, not relevant to me, I would say, I would even challenge you to think about that. And then just in general, get curious, stay curious, whether that's about your own identity, your own biases, what you can do with your work. Just get curious and continuously learn how you can improve.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Yes, Ms. Mai, please.
Just one thing I would like to add to all these beautiful thoughts, which is go find other people, go find a collective. Don't try to change the world on your own, but find other people. It's much more fun doing it together.
Yes, that's right. And thank you very much for all your insightful perspectives on these very complex issues that you broke down into actually the essential part, which is to not have a hierarchy in denouncing freedom, and to do it in an inclusive way. Thank you very much for joining us.